Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Monday, September the 28th, 2020. On this edition of the Politicrat, a conversation with Shahid Buttar. He is running against the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, here in San Francisco for the 12th Congressional District this November. And it's been the first time in 30 years at least that Speaker Pelosi has had a challenger, a serious challenger, on Election Day. My conversation with Shahid Buttar coming up next. Welcome back. So we have 36 voting days until Election Day on November 3rd. And it is important to remember that early voting is going on right now in at least 27 states across the United States. And there have been some ads, such as on CNN, saying, well, don't forget, this November 3rd, your vote is your voice. And I cringe at ads like those because when they say, don't forget this November 3rd, I really want to, reach into the television and shake them and tell them, no. What you should be telling your viewers in your ads is early vote. An early vote in person. That's what you should be telling them. Not telling them, well, on November 3rd, remember, no. We don't want to hear about November 3rd. All of the votes, the vast majority of them, I should say, are going to have been accounted for or banked, if you will, prior to November 3rd. I would say something like 70% of these votes will have occurred before November 3rd even comes around. 27 states are already voting, have been voting for 3 weeks. If not more than 3 weeks at this stage. North Carolina has been, so yeah, none of these alerts CNN with, ad spots that are showing you saying things like, don't forget November 3rd. No. Early voting is going on right now here on September 28th, 2020. So let's keep it simple, shall we? Vote early. And make sure you do it in person if you can. Really, vote early in person is the best way. Or if you're voting by mail, be sure to drop your ballot off. Make sure it's properly completed and properly put in envelopes or whatever your state's requirements are. Make sure you follow them. And of course, sign your ballot. Very important. But once you've done all of that, make sure that you either drop it off at a drop box or go to your local county board of elections and drop it off there at your voting place. That is the best way to do this. You can take a chance with the U.S. Postal Service, but at this point, since we are almost I just can't believe, we are 1 day over 5 weeks. It's come across so quickly. 5 weeks and 1 day from the end of all of this agonizing. Well, that will continue after November the 3rd, but you get what I mean. We are heading towards the finish line, and Operation Landslide is still intact and in effect, and we need to have people continue to vote wherever you are. If you haven't yet voted early, please do so. Make sure you do so in droves. Bring your friends and family and spread the word. So I wanted to say that. Then I wanted to say, of course, the big story of the weekend was the revelations in the New York Times about Donald Trump not paying any income tax in 10 out of 15 years and only paying a grand total of $750 in federal income tax in 2016 and last year, The revelations in this story in the New York Times are pretty darn strong. Read that article. I'm going to link to it. Now, it may be paywalled, but it's worth reading. Look, New York Times is far from perfect. None of these newspapers are. But the New York Times does some excellent reporting when they really focus on getting the job done. There's a number of people at the New York Times who do superb work. Really superb work. And I've actually quietly admired just how good the quality of their work is. I really have. So the New York Times is certainly has its really great moments of excellent journalism. And this is an example of it. The headline is a Times exclusive: Trump's taxes show chronic losses and years of tax avoidance. Now, this article was released roughly around 5:30 p.m. Eastern time yesterday evening, or in early evening Sunday, the 27th of September, more or less an October surprise. But I first learned of it from Ana Cabrera, who was tweeting away about this, and then she, must have been during a commercial break, because within half an hour, when she was on air on CNN, she broke the news about this story. And when I initially retweeted her, I was kind of looking at it, and I almost didn't look at it. I mean, it was just, and there was some quotes, and then the main story gets put on CNN after she had, broke it on CNN as well, and an awful lot on Twitter. And my goodness me, this thing is no joke. The Times has tax return data from him that extends over more than 2 decades. I mean, this is the New York Times story I'm talking about. It tells a story fundamentally different from the one he's sold to the public. Well, what else is new? I hate to say it like that. This is what he did with coronavirus, right? Lied to us and told Bob Woodward the truth for a book, because it was all about Donald Trump wanting to try to outsmart Bob Woodward. How did that work out? Trump's finances are under stress, beset by hundreds of millions of dollars in debt coming due, and an IRS audit that could cost him over $100 million. So, look, the fact of the matter is, and this thing goes on and on, I'm going to put a link to that. You've got to read that. This guy, the way that they lay this out, this guy has committed crimes here. And I'm guaranteeing you, the IRS are looking at this, and I know that Cyrus Vance, the Manhattan DA, is looking at it. He's already said that he's going to be most likely prosecuting Donald Trump for tax fraud. I mean, so I don't know if he was talking about this or if he was talking about some other kind of fraud, because it's clear to me that he is absolutely a tax cheat. We know that about him. It's not really that new, but the fact is that this iteration of it is new. And it certainly rocked Donald Trump, because he had really nothing much to say about it except, well, it's a fake story. That was a predictable coming from him. He would call the New York Times story a fake story. Ugh. No, it's not fake. In fact, not only is it not fake, as I said, they've got all the documents with the tax information on it, number one. And number two, they've got more stories that they're working on that are going to be coming out over the next few days. Maybe over the next few remaining weeks up until Election Day. I mean, these are stories that are going to hurt him with a few of the undecided voters, or I should say with the undecideds, and with some of the white working class and black working class. And, it's going to hurt him to that degree. Any kind of support that Donald Trump had with some of the white working class and with some black folk who, I don't know why, but they support him for whatever reason. Probably many of them are a bit more well off. But the point being is that this guy could be brought up on charges. And if the American public, which I believe they will, vote this guy out and do it in a landslide, humiliate him out of office, then pretty much as soon as the clock strikes 12, practically on January the 20th, 2021, Cyrus Vance, my goodness, he could basically have the handcuffs dangling right outside 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue for this guy. I mean, the question now is not, is he going to destroy the country any further? It's going to be, is he going to flee the country or flee it after he's destroyed it? This story in the New York Times is no small potatoes, and I get it. There are some people who knew that this guy was a tax cheat. David K. Johnston has been writing about it forever. And he has also written a book called The Making of Donald Trump, which details a lot of the kinds of thievery that he has done or is accused of doing. But when I heard this story on Sunday, my first instinct was, well, look, not a surprise. But my second instinct was, wow, this is a strong story, and it's going to certainly peel off a few voters, not these cult members, but the people who may have been considering voting for this guy and now have been completely put off. And you'll get some working class people who won't like the fact that this guy has not paid taxes. But generally speaking, I don't think the story is going to move the needle that much. The debates are going to tackle it. Certainly debate number 1 coming up tomorrow is going to tackle this. But generally speaking, I don't see this moving the needle a whole lot. I could be wrong, though. I could be wrong. Welcome back. So over the weekend, I had the pleasure of speaking to Shahid Buttar. He is the Democratic challenger to Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, here in San Francisco, California, in the 12th Congressional District. And this is the first time in earnest that the Democratic Party candidate, the incumbent, in this case Speaker Pelosi, has been challenged in her party on Election Day. It's the first time. But over the weekend, I had a conversation with Shahid Buttar. It's actually the second conversation of 2, because the first one was done and technology let me down, and it somewhat let me down again. The first time I spoke with him, we went through all manner of conversations and subjects, and unfortunately, the technology did not pan out well, so I wasn't able to get all of that recorded, which is really crazy. This time around, over the weekend, I got to speak to him, but some of the audio you hear will vacillate, but it's generally good quality. But the problem was that I failed to ask him about one key thing this second time around that I asked him the first time around. What I'm going to do is mention what that is midway through, or maybe at the end of the conversation that I had with Shahid. It's going to be a very interesting race here in the 12th Congressional District in San Francisco. And you really have to listen to this conversation. It's really an eye-opener in some instances. For some people it will be, and for others, maybe not so much. So without any further ado, here is my conversation with Shahid Buttar. Today on the Politicrat Daily Podcast, I have the distinct pleasure to have a special guest. His name is Shahid Buttar, and he is running in the 12th Congressional District in San Francisco, California, against none other than Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And I'm here to speak with Shahid right this very moment. And thank you very much for being here, sir.
Thanks for having me, Omar. It's great to be with you.
I wanted to start by asking you to tell the audience about yourself, first and foremost, before we even really get into talking about some of the topics that we're going to discuss today.
Sure. I'm an immigrant. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I'm an artist. I came to San Francisco originally to study law at Stanford in the year 2000. And over the time since then, I got engaged in the anti-war movement to try to stop Bush's wars in Iraq. I went to Washington, where I was an early advocate for marriage equality for LGBTQ couples. I was a spokesperson for the counter-inaugural demonstrations greeting Bush's second term. Came back to San Francisco to launch a project for a then startup nonprofit called Muslim Advocates fighting the FBI. That was my first taste over a decade ago of fighting the surveillance state. And then I went back to Washington leading a civil liberties organization called the Bill of Rights Defense Committee before I came back to San Francisco to join the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And over the course of the 20 years that I've been politically active, whether it was trying to stop Bush's wars or Obama's deportations and drone strikes or Trump's corruption, throughout that entire time, I've had to also challenge and confront and be, frankly, very frustrated by Nancy Pelosi's continuing complicity with that right-wing road to fascism. And the talk about resistance is cheap. I'm eager to see actual resistance. And as a Muslim immigrant to the United States who's been fighting to try to keep America free in the face of assaults from administrations from both of the major corporate political parties, I'm very acquainted with the needs of the moment, and I'm eager to represent my city in Washington.
And before we also start, it's very important to define things. And I think that some of the education, or shall I say miseducation, in aspects of our country here in the United States is that people are not necessarily sufficiently educated on some of the terminologies that people use in politics. So when I say to you democratic socialist, which is what you describe yourself as, can you explain to us what democratic socialism is?
There's lots of different ways to look at it. I approach democratic socialism particularly through a post-colonial lens and an anti-imperial lens. So in the way I approach democratic socialism is what will empower people and restrain capital. A big part of the analysis is recognizing that many of our public policy fights pit people against capital. And you can't reduce everything to that schema, but you can reduce a lot to that schema. And ultimately, I want to establish human rights to all basic human needs, to healthcare, to housing, and to food. And it is, I would say that it's barbaric that in the United States we don't recognize human rights to any of those things, except frankly, that's not fair to barbarians. I think Northern European pre-industrial tribes actually did treat each other better than we do in the United States. And that, it could be funny, but it's really not. I mean, it's horrifying the way we treat people in this country. And no population to me better demonstrates this than the people who end up homeless due to medical bankruptcy. This is the leading cause of homelessness, is people being unable to afford their medicine. And when our healthcare policy is to kick sick people into the street and abandon them, that is a collective failure. And it's a collective failure that unfortunately rests at the foot of both of the major political parties, because we democratic socialists, beyond the current time-slight knife fight between the political parties, which, just to be clear, is largely contrived around mostly ephemeral issues, we want to articulate and secure a consensus for a bold transformative vision, one that places our communities at the center of our public policy decisions instead of capital. That last piece, putting communities before capital in our public policy choices, that's one way to look at democratic socialism. Another way is to put power in the hands of the people and take it out of institutions. The frame I offered in terms of expanding human rights to encompass all basic human needs, that's a way to think of it. One big part of it to me is also the idea of limiting and conditioning the market. A lot of right-wing people pretend that the market is just a thing that exists, except it's always created and conditioned by the legal regime. And if, for instance, we don't have a market in votes, we don't have a legal market in people's kidneys, right? I mean, there are things we have said that just as legally you're not permitted to trade. There's no reason that fossil fuels are legally tradable. They don't belong to anybody now. We steal from the future with every drop and every ounce of minerals, things that we take out of the ground that we didn't put there. That is extractive. It robs the future. And the idea that we have a property regime, a legal property regime that encourages that resource plunder at the cost of the future is predatory with respect to the future. It's senseless with respect to the present, and it's ignorant with respect to the past. And I think we can do much better than that.
And I do want to say to the audience as well, full disclosure, I have met Shahid Buttar in the past at a rally several months ago that Bernie Sanders had back in February of this year. And it was
in Richmond, California, right?
Yeah, there you go. Yes. So I do want to just let everybody know that I'm also in the 12th Congressional District myself. So another thing I think that the audience should be aware of. You've outlined a couple of issues. You mentioned homelessness. You've talked about markets and how we commodify them and what they mean and what they really are about, and the legal regime controlling them. The legal, process controlling them and governing them. With regards to homelessness, as we both know, San Francisco's homelessness problem has been one that has really become even more of a huge problem for many, many years now. Do you have, or what is your specific plan about that beyond what you've articulated here in terms of homelessness, please?
It's an intersectional problem that will require intersectional solutions. So one critical, let's say, leg of the stool is a right to housing. At the moment, we treat housing like a commodity instead of like a right. And it's not to say that everybody gets a 5-bedroom mansion. But the point here is that we actually have more empty domiciles than we do homeless people. That is a flat out misallocation of resources. Any way you slice it, there's no way around that. If we have empty homes and we have people in the street, it's not rocket science for how we should fix that. A right to housing would help us get there. Another leg of that stool is the Green New Deal for public housing. I had the honor of standing behind Senator Bernie Sanders. That he and Representative Ocasio-Cortez introduced in Washington the Green New Deal for public housing. Maybe a final leg of the stool is Medicare for all. I mentioned before that the leading cause of homelessness is medical bankruptcy. When medical care and treatment is free at the point of service because it's paid for with government dollars, using and leveraging government purchasing power to drive down the cost, that will prevent one of the largest drivers of homelessness. So those are three pieces of the puzzle. Maybe one last piece I'll throw in here, which is not directly at homelessness, but addresses a tangential point, that gets raised related to it. And this is the fact that the Medicare for all encompasses mental health care. There was an era in this country when we had robust social services for people who needed them, particularly people who maybe had mental health challenges. And it was under the Reagan administration that those facilities were decommissioned, and we literally pushed an entire wave of people into the street. This is one of the things that a care infrastructure can offer us is a way to take care of people who need care. And it's exactly what we have failed to do for the last generation.
And to your point about Reagan, for the sake of people who may not be familiar, Reagan as governor of California, this happened under, you're referring to that time under Reagan, not necessarily in the 80s when he was president, although it may have.
Well, he started it as the governor, but he completed it as the president.
Right.
I'm less familiar, frankly, with the state history in that era. I was speaking more of what he did at the federal level once he came into the White House, but I certainly am not surprised that he began to peddle his neoconservative wares, in this dimension in California long before he subjected the rest of the country to it.
Now,
one thing.
Yes, sorry, go on. No, go ahead, please.
I was going to chase a random rabbit. Justice Brandeis said in another era that states are like laboratories for policy. And so we can see both in what states do at the policy level and in what political actors, politicians, and office holders do at the state level. You get indications of what they might do at the federal level. It's one reason why, many of us are, we're really excited about Senator Bernie Sanders, for instance, potentially becoming the president, because he has this track record from local service into federal office. And you can see at every stage how he showed up. Exactly what, so many other claimants, say Michael Bloomberg, for instance, show up on the other side. They're running for federal office, but you can look at what they did at the local level. And in his case, he was a Republican mayor of a major city who unapologetically engineered racist policing practices and is, now lauded by Democrats, including our city's mayor and, Nancy Pelosi. It's a craven reflection to me of the primacy of capital, again, before people, as we were talking about before.
And what's interesting, you mentioned Mike Bloomberg, and I'm sure you're probably aware of this. Most recently, he's spent a whole lot of money in Florida to resuscitate the rights of felons or ex-felons to vote in the state. And he's put a whole lot of money into that. I think that should be, I totally understand what you're saying about the policies of Bloomberg in New York. But yet, on the other hand, he's done this one thing that certainly will be of some benefit to those people who are disenfranchised and now were former felons who are being disenfranchised by Florida.
It's incredibly important to re-enfranchise people who've served their debts to society, and I don't mean at all to take away from the very important the importance of that work, and I'll even thank Bloomberg for funding whatever he has in that arena. I would just note, relative to his prior acts as a mayor, what we're basically describing is like reputation laundering. And, he still should be held accountable for the right-wing acts as a policymaker and as a mayor of a major city that he was responsible for. This is a little random, but if I can tell just maybe a 3 or 4 minute story.
Sure, of course.
It vaguely connects me to Michael Bloomberg. So here's, and it also pulls in, just as a teaser, Bernie Sanders, Christine Pelosi, and Susan Sarandon.
Wow.
Here in the New York Times. So here it goes. So sometime in February, I think, maybe March, I woke up one day to read in the New York Times that Christine Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's daughter, who serves on the Democratic National Committee, had placed a phone call to Bernie Sanders' office and at some point had spoken to Bernie Sanders and was very upset that actress Susan Sarandon had endorsed my campaign to replace Christine's mother in the House. And just to be clear, none of these people talk to me. Okay, Susan's in LA, Bernie's in Washington and Vermont, Christine's in DC and Napa, I suppose, and they're all talking about me in the New York Times, but none of them, the Pelosi's can't be bothered to debate. My response to this is that it just feels so much like high school or junior high even. And if you care that much about Susan Sarandon endorsing me, what most adults or professional politicians with some degree of ethics might do is show up for a debate and have this discussion in public. And instead, the Pelosi's, as they are wont to do, she hasn't debated anyone since the 1980s, since Reagan's era. Just to be clear, the last time Nancy Pelosi debated anyone, Ronald Reagan was the president. I mean, it is laughable, and it's appalling. We invade other countries to impose democracy, and this is what we accept here. And I want to be clear about this. It's not just the incumbents failing. This is a failure of the entire institutional press. The San Francisco Chronicle, KALW, KQED, every broadcast outlet in this city that has declined to publicly invite the speaker to a debate is failing their professional responsibility, and our democracy is suffering for it. I think it's a big part of the reason why Nancy Pelosi keeps getting reelected. If you don't defend your record and no one calls you out on it or holds you accountable on it, of course you're going to get reelected.
Right. And
we are the first. Sorry, go ahead.
I agree with you, what you've just said. Yeah, continue, please. I'm sorry.
No apology necessary. I just feel like as the first Democrat to challenge Nancy Pelosi in a general election in the course of her 30-year career, it might behoove press outlets to also show up for work and give the voters of the district the opportunity to hear the contrast between the choices before us this November.
Let me ask you about that, because you've just mentioned Speaker Pelosi and her track record. Obviously, you're running against her, and you just mentioned that you are the first Democrat to really challenge her in all these years. She's run unopposed pretty much all the time. In any really meaningful way, I would say that there's a really strong challenge by you here. But I want to just ask you about what will it take, because incumbency, whether people are educated or not, let's just be frank about this. Incumbency is a very powerful thing. And there is a thing with certain voters or with a certain subset or any voter, there's a comfort level that they have with people. I mean, yes. You can look at Mitch McConnell, every time that he's been in the Senate, Kentucky, resources poor, education poor, they're in the bottom 5 states in healthcare and all these segments, but yet voters, 6 year after 6 year after 6, they put him back in. Yep. Nancy Pelosi over here is the speaker. same kinds of things going on? Obviously, San Francisco's not in the bottom of these things, but things that haven't necessarily improved for the average San Franciscan. How do you deal with that whole title of incumbency? How do you do that as a candidate who is a democratic socialist? And granted, you've got Chesa Boudin, who's come in San Francisco as the DA here, Dean Preston, who has been elected Board of Supervisors all within the last year. How do you challenge incumbency, specifically Speaker Pelosi?
So just to unpack, sort of the dimensions of the problem, the power of incumbency with Pelosi is frankly just the tip of the iceberg. She's not merely an incumbent. She is the incumbent with a capital T. She is the head of the Democratic Party. So not only does she have the powerful tools of incumbency, like the franking privilege, she can send free mail across the city. It costs us $50,000 to send a piece of mail to everyone in the city. So it's not a thing we've done. We focused on other ways of reaching voters, like online outreach and in-person outreach, knocking on doors, calling people, live outdoor socially distanced events during the pandemic. So taking the case straight to the people is a big part of the response. But just to finish the point about the power of her incumbency in particular, she imposes a dramatic chilling effect across anyone in the party who has any aspirations. So the entire institutional wing of even self-described progressives in San Francisco are beholden to this incumbent. Every labor union in the city has endorsed Nancy Pelosi because she's powerful, even though her policies undermine the interests of their rank and file. That's a degree of, sort of co-optation, complicity. I don't want to say corruption because that's a little bit strong, but just the co-optation of parts of the community that claim to stand for universal health care, that claim to stand for migrant rights, that claim to stand against wars for plunder, but still support a figure in Washington who enables all of those things. And, I would say that I'm something like a walking object of shame to the city's progressive community, which talks a big game about its supposed set of principles. But, people feel constrained from being public in their support. For instance, I know, as a matter of fact, because they've told me, that at least half the Board of Supervisors has voted for me. But they dare not endorse me in public because Nancy Pelosi is the head of the Democratic Party. I've been told by a state legislator, a retired state legislator, no less, I love you. I love what you stand for. I want you in Congress, and I dare not cross her or she will end my career. This is someone who already retired after 17 years serving in the state legislature. That's the kind of chilling effect that she imposes. So it's not just incumbency. It's incumbency plus the power of a party apparatus that is, frankly, weaponized to silence dissent. The DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, at the beginning of this congressional cycle, issued a rule that any challengers to incumbent representatives and anyone who works with them will be blacklisted, which basically said to any consultant in the political class, don't touch that guy, because if you work with him, you're never working with us again. And then at the same time, Nancy Pelosi turns around and endorses Joe Kennedy over a sitting U.S. Senator, Ed Markey, who's the co-author of the Green New Deal, which is to say, violating her own rule while undermining climate justice and, just to top it off, promoting nepotism and dynastic politics in the face of our nation's once proud commitment to democracy. So many things here to say, but I would just note those challenges. And again, the way we work around it is very much just taking the case to the people. In the course of the pandemic, that's really meant a lot of street actions, a lot of phone banking, a lot of text banking, a lot of online outreach. We're doing everything we can to reach voters, particularly in the context of a sustained corporate media whiteout that has really silenced our campaign's voice, and particularly as the incumbent has refused to debate, kept voters in the dark about her record and the alternative that we present.
Now, you just mentioned, you talked about the media, corporate media whiteout, and you talked about these progressive groups here in San Francisco that have really turned their back on you and just have gone against you, which is staggering to me. I shouldn't be that naive about this because I'm really not, but I'm still surprised by it and shocked by it, I should say. How about progressive media? This is a key question to you. Have you been being picked up at all by progressive media? There's Free Speech TV, the Tom Hartman Show, Democracy Now!, all of these types of outlets. Have you been able to get anything from them at all, or any attention from them?
Not the particular outlets that you mentioned, but generally within the sphere of progressive independent media, I've been very grateful for lots of opportunities to reach voters. In fact, I'd say that this has been a big part of what's built our campaign. The opportunities to speak to voters through outlets like the Young Turks, outlets like Jacobin, news outlets, from bloggers and podcasters like yourself, to people with substantial web presences online. I'm thinking of, for instance, say the Humanist Report, or Michael Brooks, the late Michael Brooks, when he was with us, was very generous with his time and brought me on a few times. Sam Sater at the Majority Report, others. There have been so many independent journalists who frankly shown up for journalism. And I want to make this point. It's not showing up for me or our campaign. You might say it's showing up for San Francisco, even though many of these people don't live here, but it's really showing up for democracy. When journalists cover issues and candidates, they're performing a constitutional function. It's why we sometimes call the press the fourth branch. And whenever we have news recycling 24-hour headlines that is just the same headline over and over again, or covering some vapid story, that about Kamala Harris's shoes or whatever, like, these are disservices to democracy. They damage our civic fabric because they frankly distract people from important information, and they distract journalists from stories that they frankly should be writing. And I'm very, at the same time that, CNN and the local broadcast outlets have generally silenced us, I'm very grateful to the likes of Michael Figueroa and Pasta Giardelli and Tim Black, and Peter B. Collins, the independent folks, Ronnie Akalek and Kevin Gastola, who have brought us on. So many journalists have helped expose the broader public to our campaign's message. And it's one reason why I think we've attracted such support. I'm very grateful to have the support of over 30,000 donors from across the country. We won 33,000 votes this spring. And in addition to those supporters, we have thousands of volunteers who've come together. And it's really a function of the opportunities to connect, because we haven't had it through the corporate media. Social media has been one way we've connected with people. Again, these online events and in-person events have been another, but the independent press that you're drawing attention to have really been a critical part of the ecosystem enabling our campaign to flourish.
Now, you mentioned social media. I'll ask you just a few more questions, but I wanted you to just mention the social media handles that people can follow you at, and also the all-important website as well for your campaign as well.
Thanks, Omar. On social media, folks can find us on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, YouTube at Shahid for Change. That's SHAHID FORCHANGE. And folks can find us online on the web at shahidforchange.us. Excellent.
A few other things that I'd like to ask you. One, in terms of dealing with climate, you've talked a little bit about that. You've talked a bit about homelessness. What are the other issues that are near and dear to you that you can represent San Francisco in Washington on as effectively as the ones you've already mentioned that we haven't talked about yet?
Thank you so much for putting this on the table. Before, I was sharing how my democratic socialism is particularly inflected by a post-colonial sensibility. One thing that means is that I'm very concerned about authoritarianism in all of its various dimensions. So this is what compels me to have been part of the movement for Black Lives since and even before the Ferguson uprising in 2014. It's what compelled me to be part of the movement for immigrant rights in the early 2010s and late 2000s. And it's part of what compels me to be particularly concerned with the intersection of all these issues today, from the DHS fascist goon squads that have cracked down on dissent in Portland and Kenosha. Goon squads, incidentally, paramilitary dissent suppression units funded by the Democrats as well as Republicans. Everything from them to the eugenics practiced at border concentration camps straight out of the Nazi playbook, also funded by Democrats and Republicans alike. Everything from them to the mass NSA surveillance regime that we have extended around the planet illegitimately without any mandate. That also funded by Democrats and Republicans. And maybe I'll tell a quick story there about the NSA because this is a particular bug in my bonnet. People might remember the Snowden revelations from 2013. So I've been banging that drum since 5 years before he came forward. And when he came forward in 2013, many of us who were advocates in the civil liberties community basically had anticipated that all these things were happening. We weren't able to prove it. We knew from the legal analysis that the government claimed the right to do these things, or the authorities, but we didn't have the smoking gun evidence saying that they were taking advantage of these loopholes. He brought it forward and Congress did nothing. In 2015, I was arrested in the U.S. Senate a few months after speaking in the House at the invitation of a House member. In the Senate, I'd asked Obama's Director of National Intelligence, this is James Clapper, I asked him after the conclusion of a hearing, well within my rights as a journalist, how do you justify never facing a charge for perjury, despite lying to the U.S. Senate under oath about an issue of grave public importance, when just a few months before I asked the question, this was spring 2015, and in the fall of 2014, Eric Garner was killed in the streets of New York without a charge, without a trial, on the mere suspicion that he had sold cigarettes to someone. And what I was asking Clapper is, how can you, a powerful person, commit a grave crime on the public record and escape without any penalties at all, with a pension, and repeat appearances on MSNBC to continue peddling his wares while Eric Garner is 6 feet under? And the only person who went to jail in the incident when he was killed, viewed by hundreds of millions of people, was the person capturing the video.
Ramsey Orta.
Ramsey Orta, that's right. How can we claim to live under a system of laws when powerful people can commit grave public offenses out in the open with impunity, and powerless people meet lethal justice on the mere suspicion of trivial offenses? This was under Obama. People think it's bad under Trump, and it is, obviously. I'm not going to say it was any worse before. I mean, fascism is not creeping anymore. It is sprinting.
Right.
But it was creeping before. And for anybody who didn't see it before Trump, all I can say is I told you so, and I would like to step us over the next pitfall. The corporate Democrats, I mentioned all the different ways in which they've facilitated this moment. Well, I mentioned some of them. There are, frankly, many more than that. I could get into immigrant rights. I could get into executive secrecy, torture, mass incarceration, wars for plunder. On all of these issues, Nancy Pelosi has paved the road actively of the right wing, not merely demonstrating insufficient resistance, but actively facilitating the rise of fascism while claiming to mount resistance to it. And that is unacceptable to me. I am not willing to be represented in Washington by a figure who puts their party's fundraising goals before the urgent imperatives to which they're committed by an oath of office to defend the Constitution, our republic, against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I fear that she doesn't entirely understand what that commitment even means enough to show up for it, right? Donald Trump's idea of work is to put money in his pocket, our money in his pocket, and Nancy Pelosi's idea of work is to raise money off of his excesses. And someone has to show up for work in Washington. And that's why I'm running to replace Pelosi and give our city a new voice.
Right. I'm going to just ask you something, but I'm going to pause for a second. I need to correct something on my audio here for 1 second, if you can.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, great. So perfect. My question for you, you just mentioned Speaker Pelosi. My question is, do you think that she's enabling Donald Trump? Is that what I'm hearing you say, or can you just tell me, is that what you think's going on?
Well, that's not what I think is going on. It is, in fact, what is happening. The public record demonstrates it quite clearly in about 100 different ways. The border concentration camps. Donald Trump signed the order. It was Nancy Pelosi who wrote the check. His military budget, $750 billion, unprecedented sum in human history. He requested it. Nancy Pelosi whipped votes for the bill. The very same day that the House announced its late and limited impeachment charade, and I can take that apart in a minute if we're interested, the very same day that impeachment was announced, Nancy Pelosi approved Donald Trump's corporate trade agreement, which undermined labor and environmental standards around the world. Impeachment is a thing. Let's just unpack that really quick. I don't say this as a Monday morning quarterback. I wrote in writing in a piece shared by our nation's leading authority on constitutional law, Lawrence Tribe, the analysis of how to impeach the president. And it's all about the way we could have done it, the way we should have done it, is emoluments, corruption. The president, every official in the United States is constitutionally prohibited from self-enrichment at public expense. And that's all he does. And I think the reason Nancy Pelosi didn't want to go there is that is unfortunately a very bipartisan practice. which is to say, and she took all the impeachment charges off the table, as well as all the human rights violations and the lies to the public. The one thing that Nancy Pelosi allowed to be included in the articles of impeachment was a partisan crime that had no hope of ever convicting anyone in the Senate. And that was obvious from the outset. And I said as much, frankly, 6 months before she ever showed up. And it's just a perfect example of her enabling Trump. Everything she has ever done, claiming resistance to this criminal president, has been theatrical. Tearing up a speech, pointing across a table, sideways clapping. That, she actually said, wasn't even ironic, and she has claimed that her sideways clap was meant to be like she was honoring him. And it makes sense because they're from the same social class, right? They're both incredibly powerful people who govern through theater, who were born into vast wealth and privilege, and are leading family dynasties. And that should gross anyone out. I did not. My family did not move around the world twice so that in our democracy we could be reduced to subjects among competing family dynasties. That's not democracy. And I'm as offended by nepotism as I am by bipartisan corporate rule. And I see the incumbent from issues from climate justice to certainly surveillance. Everything in the national security arena particularly demonstrates this complicity. But also think about the legislative responses to the pandemic. You know, in the early versions of the coronavirus stimulus packages, what Nancy Pelosi chose to prioritize were tax breaks for millionaires, averaging $1.6 million each for 43,000 tax filers who claim more than $1 million a year in annual income. That was included in the original coronavirus stimulus bills before any rent and mortgage relief, before any ongoing universal basic income program, before universal paid sick leave. If we want to flatten the curve, we might make sure that people can stay home and get paid if they're sick. But that's not what Congress saw fit to do. They did expand sick leave to encompass exactly 20% of the workforce and then called it a day. And this is what corporate Democrats do. They engage in some act of meaningful at the margin, but ultimately meaningless theater, and then raise funds from their corporate donors, appealing to their sense of moral righteousness, saying, look, we're doing something for working people.
You talked about Speaker Pelosi, and you mentioned that there are these opportunities that she had to do certain things, and she put in tax breaks or tax cuts or protections for the upper classes, the richest classes. Can you just go through that again? And I'm sorry to have you repeat that.
Oh, no worries. So, yeah, this was the early versions of the first stages of the coronavirus stimulus packages included a new set of tax deductions to allow people who earn vast sums to deduct, particularly local and state taxes, from their federal income taxes that they owe. And statistically, that vastly benefits the 1%. And of the benefits from this tax reduction, the vast majority will go to the average tax benefit is $1.6 million. And that's the average across a pool of 43,000 tax filers who annually claim more than $1 million a year in income. And that has passed. That became the law. And at no point has Congress meaningfully considered rent and mortgage relief, as an eviction wave continues to build and spread across the country. At no point has Congress meaningfully considered a universal basic income program. They considered a one-time cash payment to some filers of $1,200, which in the grand scheme of things, it's better than we got in the 2008 financial crisis, and it is still a pittance. And my favorite example of this is that while Congress did recognize the need to extend paid sick leave to make sure that people could stay home if they get sick, right? That's one way that we could flatten the curve. When Congress executed that reform, they had so many exceptions and carve-outs to the rule that it only covered 20% of the workforce. So what exactly is the point? And this is a part of a pattern, a repeated pattern of corporate Democrats showing up for some meaningful at the margin, but ultimately in the grander context, meaningless nod to a set of issues, and then relating to that set of issues as a thing that they can raise money from donors for supporting, whether or not they're actually supporting, in fact, those issues. Immigrant rights is a perfect example here. Democrats will talk about supporting immigrant rights, but they won't actually do anything to support us. And I could tell this story 20 different ways. In fact, one of the reasons I got into this race originally in 2018 was a moment it was February, maybe January 2018. And Nancy Pelosi, I do want to give her sincere credit for this. It was a feat of remarkable physical endurance and dexterity. A woman of her age, I think at the time she was 78 years old, and she read for 8 hours from a podium in the House without stopping for breaks, without using the restroom. I mean, honestly, it is frankly astounding. I'm very impressed with the physical endurance of it, but her act of reading letters from DREAM Act students was ultimately a theatrical photo op and cover for her selling out migrant rights in a budget negotiation that was happening at the same time. And Raul Grijalva, who's the chair of the Immigrant Rights Caucus in the House, he was quite sharp in his criticism. And it's yet again a perfect example of her pattern, just like ripping a speech, of acting like she's doing something, kneeling in kente cloth, acting like she's doing something while, in that instance, while she was kneeling in kente cloth and forgetting George Floyd's name at the press conference where she introduced the bill named after him, the bill that expanded police budgets and expanded police surveillance, while kneeling in kente cloth and trying to get credit for showing up for the movement. And I've been fighting for the positive elements of the Justice and Policing Act for over a decade, while noting all of the problematic provisions that they then decided to shoehorn into it. And I'm just tired of saying, I told you so. I see in sharp relief and in slow motion, because I've been working on this stuff for 20 years, all of the different ways that Nancy Pelosi is actively working to undermine San Francisco's values in order to establish and entrench executive and institutional power in Washington. And I'm not okay with that. No San Franciscan should be okay with that. And that's exactly why we have a choice before us this November, and it's why I'm looking forward to representing San Francisco in the next session of Congress.
One last thing, and I do appreciate your time. What would you say now to San Francisco voters in the 12th Congressional District here? Obviously, the election is coming up. Early voting in person begins on October 5th here in San Francisco and in California, but in San Francisco, particularly in-person voting, if mail-in voting ballots get sent out that same day. So what would you like in the next few moments to encapsulate a message to tell voters here in the 12th Congressional District about your campaign and what you will do if you're elected to Washington, D.C. office?
We have a choice, and San Francisco deserves to be represented in Congress by a voice in the squad instead of a voice suppressing its vision. Everybody in this city, everybody across the entire West Coast saw written in the sky on September 9th a very visible alarm signal that something is not right. Something is wildly amiss. The skies were red at high noon. And that's just a symbol of more to come. The climate catastrophe that is already wreaking havoc across our state, it's not going to get any better. And the question is, will we keep sending back to Washington agents of the same extractive, predatory paradigm that delivered us to this crisis? The very same people whose faux resistance has empowered a fascist, aspiring tyrant? Or are we going to send to Washington people who've stood with our communities in the face of institutional abuses long before it was popular? I was fighting for gay rights before it was popular. I fought for environmental sustainability before it was popular. I fought to try to stop wars and protect human rights before it was popular. I'm eager to continue those fights on behalf of our city, empowered with the opportunities that a member of Congress can have. And just to make it very concrete for people, the last time I had an opportunity to ask questions in Congress, they arrested me because nobody wants to hear those questions, let alone answer them. And I'm very eager to get some answers for we the people of the United States and my neighbors here in San Francisco.
Thank you so much, Shahid Buttar. Really appreciate your time, sir. All the very best in this coming election. Of course, your website again, shahidforchange.us. And of course, you can be found on Twitter, the same Twitter handle, except without the US part of the ad.
That's right. Shahid for Change on all the social media platforms. So good to be with you. Thank you for bringing me on today, Omar.
Thank you very much for being on the Politicrat podcast. Take care now.
You too.
Shahid Buttar, running for the 12th Congressional District of California in San Francisco to represent the city in Washington, D.C. He's trying to unseat the incumbent Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And I appreciate Shahid for coming on the podcast. And I should add one thing here for the purposes of journalistic record. This was the second conversation that I had had with Shahid. And unfortunately, the first one I had, for some reason, on my end and my fault, the technology completely gave up on me, or I gave up on it. And the conversation that we had was not properly recorded. During that conversation, I had asked Shahid about the allegations that were made against him by a woman just a couple of months ago, that he had sexually harassed her. Now, for reasons known only to me, and I don't even know why, I completely forgot to ask him about that again on this second conversation. So that's my fault. But what I can tell you is that in the first conversation, he defended himself and said that the allegations were not true. He tweeted about this during the month of July, in fact, July the 21st, on the same day in which the woman who had accused him had made the allegations. The allegations that were made were in a newspaper or online paper, The Intercept, which Shahid in the previous conversation had said had not properly even looked at his side of the story. And the bottom line is that there were, according to Shahid, some people who used to work on his campaign who had been saying that Shahid had been doing these things and had agreed with the particular woman in question. Shahid had let go of those people from his campaign for what he calls performance reasons. And there was another individual who was asked, according to Shahid, to come out against him, and that individual refused to. And again, I'm really sorry to everybody listening that I did not, ask him about this again in the second conversation. And I'm really sorry that the first conversation that we had was not properly recorded, or it didn't come out properly, because he talked about this in great detail and went to some way toward refuting the allegations. Now, it should also be said, and I'm going to put links to both the woman's allegations, which were in an article in Medium, and I will also put a link to the tweets from Shahid as well, so that you can look at those, because the woman in question had written an article in Medium about this. So I think the best way to address this is to put the article by the woman who had written about this, accusing Shahid, put a link to that in the notes of this particular episode, and also put the tweets by Shahid also in the liner notes as well, so you can see both of them. But I can tell you that when I spoke to him the first time, he had spoken about a history of white women falsely accusing black and brown men of sexual assault. So that also was part of that conversation as well. Again, I really disappointed in myself that the technology let me down, and that's my fault. So I take full responsibility. And there you have it. I mean, that's the thing, is the way that I can really put that out on the table. And again, I will include the link to the article by the woman in question, and I will also include the tweets from Shahid, who has also added that he is happy to talk about, not happy, but he is completely fine with talking about the allegations. And when I talked to him the first time, he certainly, I think, showed that. So people can judge for themselves. But what I saw in this interview was someone who is very clear about where he wants to and how he wants to represent San Francisco. So there you have it. And thank you again to Shahid Buttar for coming on and talking about where he wants to take San Francisco as a member of Congress in Washington, D.C. I hope you enjoyed listening to that interview. And again, there was still some audio problems in that interview. So, I mean, I need to really get that all straightened out. But I hope you were able to enjoy the interview and listen to what Shahid had to say. And for those of you here in San Francisco who are in the 12th District, you have a choice between Shahid Buttar, who is a progressive and democratic socialist, and you have the incumbent Nancy Pelosi, who is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who has represented the district for, I think, a bit more than 30 years now. I endeavor, by the way, to get a representative for Speaker Pelosi to come on, and I hope that that person does, if not the Speaker herself, quite frankly. I mean, I know that she's extremely busy, but I certainly am reaching out to someone in her organization, in her campaign. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.